Today is a guest that I've been playing round robin and tag with email, trying to get him onto the show. We taped the show a couple months back for the anthology Jack of All Comic, which Jim Beard put together. Keith is also a published author and whatever. Keith, tell the fans a little bit about yourself.
Well, I am a writer, as you said. I've been writing fiction professionally since 1994. I have written over 60 novels, over 135 short stories, maybe more at this point, more than 75 comic books, and more nonfiction than I can really count because math is hard. I've also been an editor in the field for a while and done a whole bunch of other things as well, mostly in the science fiction, fantasy, horror, mystery, superhero genres.
So you came up as an editor through Byron Press and became the editorial director of Marvel novels. Is that correct?
Yeah, we did a line of Marvel Comics based novels and short story anthologies from 1994 to 2000, and I was in charge of that.
Did you always see yourself being in the comic book industry, or did you just fall into it?
I was lucky. I always wanted to be. My first job out of college was
The Library Journal?
for Library Journal. Yeah, that was my first job. I worked as an assistant editor there for a couple of years, and then I moved over to work for Byron. And I always loved comics. I've been reading comics since I was very small. And I love the opportunity to get involved in the comics industry, however minor it was. My comics work is much less than my prose work, but I've been doing it for a while. And some of my prose work is also comics adjacent. I edited the Marvel novels. That was a huge project. We did 50 or so books altogether featuring Spider-Man, the X-Men, the Avengers, and so on. And it was a great project. I loved working on that. It's one of the things, looking back on my career now, that I'm proudest of having been involved in.
So you also do a lot of licensed properties outside of DC and Marvel.
Yeah.
What are some of the pros and cons that fans might not be aware of with all that?
There are a lot more hoops. You've got to get everything approved by the people who own it. So that adds an extra layer of stuff to the process. I've worked at it both as an editor and as a writer. And it can be very difficult, but it can also be very rewarding. Some of the best work I've done and some of the most fun projects I've been involved with have been licensed material. I mentioned the Marvel novels. That's actually a really good example. It started out difficult because it always starts out difficult because you're trying to figure out what they want, what you want to do and stuff. But once we got going with it, it was tremendous fun. And the people who were doing the approvals at Marvel were great. It was at the time it was a division called Marvel Creative Services. Their job was to approve all the licensed material. And the two guys I worked with there were fantastic. It was Mike Thomas and Steve Bailing. And they were really good creative partners on it. For that matter, for the people who have been in charge of approving Star Trek licensed fiction during the time that I've done it, first it was Paula Block, and then she was assisted by John Van Sitters, and then when Paula retired, John took over. Both of them are fantastic to work with. They're both Star Trek fans in addition to being licensing people. So they do a wonderful job of overseeing. Both Paula and John are huge Star Trek fans also, and they also understand how book publishing works and how comic book publishing works. So they're also really good creative partners. There are other instances where it's horrible. I have a good friend named Kim Kindia who used to work for Simon & Schuster Interactive. She worked on the Star Trek CD-ROMs that came out in the 90s and early 2000s. And she said something once on a panel, nobody goes to Hollywood to get into licensing. A lot of times you will get people who are in this job because it's the only job they could get and they don't want it and they're not very good at it. And it can be very frustrating. And you get people who understand how the movie business works or how the comics business works, but don't understand how the prose business works. Or movie and TV people who don't understand how comics work. And it can be incredibly frustrating. You take the good with the bad. And some of the projects have been wonderful to work with. And one thing in particular I have noticed has gotten better over the course of my career over the last 35 years. There's a lot more people involved in the creation of genre TV and movies who read tie-in fiction when they were growing up. So you're getting people who legitimately want the tie-in fiction to be good and to be, in sync with what they're doing. So as an example, 10 years ago, I did a novella to tie into the TV show Heroes. They brought that show back for a 12-episode miniseries called Heroes Reborn. And they also did 6 novellas that tied into it. And those were actually supervised by the showrunner, which I didn't realize. Like, I was getting notes from somebody, I didn't know who it was. It wasn't a name I recognized. And then the miniseries aired, and I'm like, oh, that's the last guy, the last executive producer listed before Tim Kring, who was the creator of it. This was much bigger than I thought. This explains why we were getting such extensive notes, which was great. It was great to have that level of cooperation, and that more often now than you used to, which is, like I said, wonderful. It's good to get that level of cooperation. A lot of times, particularly earlier in my career, you do tie-in fiction, and the people approving it either didn't know about it or didn't care about it enough, and they would just rubber stamp anything, which can be very freeing creatively, but it also means that you're not always in sync with what's happening in the thing you're tying into.
It seems like over the last 5 or 6 years, the various corporate people involved with things are more, there's more synergy and in sync with what's going on with everybody. It's more controlled and everybody's kind of like on the same page versus like in the like DC in the 70s, they were trying to do the Superman movie and DC Comics was on one page, movie was on a different page, and they really never were in sync. But nowadays, it seems like they are more in sync. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I think it goes back further than 5 or 6 years. It's really around the turn of the millennium when you really started seeing it more often. I started seeing it in the late 90s, and it's gotten better as time has gone on. Part of it is just the awareness of multiple media and the fact that people consume things in multiple media, which is something that a lot of the large production houses are more aware of. And it's better for everybody. It makes for a better experience if everybody's working together as opposed to at cross purposes.
Is there more of a push in licensing away from books and more into comic books these days?
Not really, because comics don't sell that well. You're not seeing as you're still seeing tie-in fiction. It's not as common as it was, but these things go in phases too. But you're more likely to see books just because that's a more lucrative income stream. There's always a downturn in interest once something is no longer in active production, with very rare exceptions like Star Trek, Star Wars, and Doctor Who are the exceptions that prove the rule. Those 3 are in their own category. But most properties, there's less interest once it's not in active production, which means they usually can't always support a tie-in line because of the way book publishing has gone over the last 20 years or so. You're also seeing smaller presses that can afford to acquire a license for something that won't sell as well, but it can keep them going because their standards for success are lower than it would be for a large New York publisher. There's ways to make it work. And there are so many different ways of publishing books and so many different levels of publishing of books, which is the same thing you're seeing in TV and movies. It's no longer a case where TV shows are only on one of 3 networks. So there's lots of different options for everybody.
Do you have a property that you really enjoy working on? And is there one that you can't wait or would love to work on in the future?
Oh, sure. Listing my favorite is the tie between Star Trek and Farscape. Star Trek because that's what I've written the most in anyway. And I've been a Star Trek fan literally since birth. But I still love the property and love working on it. Even though right now most of the work I've been doing has been nonfiction. We're writing about the franchise. But Farscape just because I got to do so much with it. I wrote one of the first Farscape tie-in novels. The first one was released in the States. It was the second one to be released in the UK. And I wrote some short stories for the official magazine, and then I got to do 3 years worth of comic books that basically continued the story forward after the Peacekeeper Wars. And I got to work directly with Rockne O'Bannon, who created the show. That was one of the best. That is also one I list as one of my fondest experiences looking back over my career. Getting to do those comics was absolutely fantastic.
So,
something I loved that much forward. Because Farscape is still one of my favorite shows.
So hypothetically, if you're doing something with Star Trek, do you approach them or how does that all work out for a novel or something?
Right now, it's they find you because the line is less aggressive than it's been in the past, and it's currently up for renewal. So the current contract is full, so they're not looking for anything right now. But it goes in fits and starts. There was a period there where they were actively seeking out new voices, and they had the Strange New Worlds anthology series, which ran in the late 90s, which was specifically was only open to submissions from non-professional authors. It was a way to give fans a chance to write stuff, and it was also a great place for people to start their careers. Dayton Ward got his start there. Pedro Weldon, who's gone on to a wonderful career, Ilsa J. Dick, Jeffrey Thorne, William Leisner, a bunch of other people who sold to Strange New Worlds and then developed a career. There's one author, she writes under a different name than she wrote for Strange New Worlds, but her first professional sale was to Strange New Worlds, and she's gone on to become, under a different name, a New York Times bestselling author. It was a great entry point for people. That is no longer available. But at this point, I'm well enough established that I can probably at least get the chance to pitch to something if I want to. Whether that pitch will be taken is an open question. I've pitched plenty of things that have been rejected even now, and I'm sure I will continue to pitch things that get rejected. That's just the nature of the business.
Are you more of a DC or Marvel fan?
More of a Marvel fan. I grew up. My intro to superheroes was, and I'm showing my age here. There was a kids show in the '70s called The Electric Company, and they had the rights to do stuff with Spider-Man, and that was my introduction to Spider-Man. And then my parents got me a subscription to a tie-in comic book they did called Spidey Super Stories, which were young adult Spider-Man stories. And that was my entry point into being a Marvel fan. So that's what I grew up with. I like the DC heroes also, but I'm more of a Marvel guy than a DC guy.
Are you somebody that still reads current comic books, or you just don't read them much anymore?
I just don't have time. I have a subscription to Marvel Unlimited, and I'll read certain things if something catches my eye on there. I admit I have that subscription mainly for older stuff, but every once in a while, if there's something that catches my attention. As an example, when Daredevil Born Again started up last year, I went over to Marvel Unlimited and read the Daredevil comics that established the Kingpin as the mayor of New York, because that's what they were basing the story on. I wanted to read the original story it was based on for background, which was very useful. And so, yeah, stuff like that. I don't keep up with as much, partly because of time, partly because of money. But,
Yes.
But I like to at least be aware of what's.
Do you still like to write comic book stories yourself? And what have you done in the past that fans might know of?
Most hilariously, given what we've been talking about, pretty much all the comics I've done have been licensed in some form or other. I've done a few Star Trek comics. I did a miniseries back in 1999 for Wildstorm called Perchance to Dream. That was a Next Generation comic. Did a couple of one-shots for IDW for their Alien Spotlight series. I did a Klingon issue, and for their Captain's Log series, I did one on Jellicoe. I've done a couple of StarCraft manga one-shot. It was actually the first in the series, but I only did the first one. I just, a couple of years ago, did a Resident Evil comic book, which was a prequel to the Infinite Darkness animated series. And I'm currently working on a comic book adaptation of a novel, that I co-wrote, which is called Animal. It was a serial killer novel that I wrote with Dr. Manish K. Batra. I am working with J.K. Woodward to adapt it into a 5-issue comic book, which Comic Mix will be publishing. We haven't scheduled it yet. We're trying to get all 5 issues done, and then we'll schedule. It'll probably start coming out later this year.
So you've done this for like 35 years.
I should mention also, I mentioned this before, but the Farscape comics, that's the biggest project, and the one people are most likely to be aware of, especially since 2 years ago, for the 25th anniversary, Boom Studios re-released those comic books in 2 very large graphic novels that collected all 56 comic books that we did. We did 3 4-issue miniseries, a monthly series that lasted 24 issues, and then I did 3 Dargo-focused miniseries, and then Rockney worked with David Mack to do Scorpius miniseries that lasted 8 issues.
Is it hard for somebody nowadays to break in like you did over the last decades?
Oh, it's always hard to break in. And honestly, my method of breaking in was completely non-replicable. I broke in because I was an editor. That's how I got started. I was working as an editor for Byron Price. I was working with people who were also doing other projects, and that gave me the opportunity to pitch. That was just dumb luck on my part that I was in the right place at the right time. Having said that, one of the reasons why I was able to turn that into a career was because I did work that people liked. I did stuff that got approved. I hit my deadlines. My stuff sold, and apparently I have some talent, so I leave that to other people to judge. But so the opportunity was lucky, but the taking advantage of the opportunity was due to my own hard work. And the thing is, you ask any 10 writers how they broke in, you get 12 different answers. There's no one way to break in, and you just got to try everything until something works.
You also like to do a lot of historical pieces, don't you? For comic books.
What do you?
Like historical pieces, like with Jim Beard and talking about.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I misunderstood.
No, that's fine.
Yeah, no, I love writing about comics. One of the multitudinous bits of nonfiction that I've done is for a website called Reactor Magazine. It used to be called Tor.com. Now it's Reactor Magazine. I've done a lot of stuff for them since 2011, mostly about Star Trek. And I'm also currently doing a rewatch of Babylon 5. But I've also been doing for them pieces on each live action movie based on a superhero comic. I did that as a weekly feature from 2017 to 2020, at which point I had caught up to real time. But I revived the feature either once every 6 months or once every year, depending, to bring in to look at what had been released since or stuff I missed the first time. And so I love writing those. Those articles are divided into 3 segments. The introduction, which includes historical background on the comic books that the movie is based on, the development of the movie, and so on. And then the plot description, and then a review. And I love that. I love writing about that. And I've also done a bunch of stuff for Jim Beard and for some other folks, for Crazy 8 Press, and for Smart Pop, up at Bella Books, and some others, just think pieces on various bits of comics history, which I really enjoy doing.
Keith, I'm going to wrap this up. I appreciate you joining me. I was really curious about this whole licensing thing and your whole career because it just sounded fascinating. Appreciate you joining me for this conversation.